It was the sound, first, that defined survival. In Jedediah Miller's cabin, the dominant sound was the wet, hacking cough of its occupant, a man slowly choking on his own wood smoke. The secondary sound, the one that kept him awake, was the splintering. It was August 1883, and a 700-pound grizzly was testing the integrity of his 14-inch lodgepole pine walls. Miller was barricaded behind a 6-inch thick door bar, his rifle aimed at the dark, his cabin interior a suffocating 85 degrees Fahrenheit near the fire and a damp 50 degrees near the walls. He was trapped, living inside a poorly lit, badly ventilated wooden box that doubled as a bear bait station. 3 miles down the creek, Silas Weir's cabin was silent. The air inside was cool, measuring a consistent 68 degrees. It was fresh, moving in a draft so subtle it could only be detected by the slow, steady curl of smoke from his pipe. When the same grizzly had visited Weir an hour earlier, it had scraped its claws against the door, pushed once with its full weight, huffed at a series of small, strange holes near the foundation, and finding no purchase, moved on. Weir's cabin, built with smaller logs and containing what Miller called foolishness, had defeated the bear not with mass, but with design. While Miller choked on stale air and prayed his brute force fortress would hold, Weir was sleeping soundly, breathing clean mountain air that was, paradoxically, the very thing keeping him safe. What did this quiet, ex-shipwright from Maine understand about structural dynamics and airflow that an entire generation of seasoned, hardened mountain men had completely missed? The year was 1883. The place, the high, unforgiving valleys of the Colorado Rockies, perched at 9,500 feet. This was the fringe of the great silver boom, a land of sudden wealth and even more sudden death. Men flooded the territory, not as homesteaders, but as prospectors, required by law to prove up a claim by building a cabin, a minimal structure of at least 10 by 12 feet. The climate was the true enemy. Winter temperatures plunged to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, while the high-altitude summer sun baked the thin air, creating stifling heat. And then there were the grizzlies, displaced by the mining and hungrier than ever. The conventional wisdom, published in pamphlets in Denver and repeated as gospel around campfires, was singular: build a fortress. The trapper's box was the standard. This meant using the largest diameter logs available, often 14 to 18 inches, saddle-notched and chinked with a slurry of mud, moss, and animal hair. Doors were to be fashioned from 3-inch thick planks, cross-braced, and hung on massive iron hinges. Windows were a liability, kept to a minimum, perhaps 1 or 2, no larger than 18 inches square, and fitted with heavy wooden shutters that were barred from within. This design philosophy treated the cabin as a static object, a blunt instrument designed to resist nature. It created a dark, damp, and profoundly unhealthy living space. The massive stone fireplace required for heat was tragically inefficient, consuming nearly a cord of wood every 2 weeks. Worse, it drew its combustion air from the cabin's only air source, its own internal volume. This created a powerful negative pressure, sucking the smoke back down the chimney and into the room, while pulling icy drafts through every tiny crack in the chinking. The result was a cabin with 2 distinct, toxic microclimates, a small, smoke-filled inferno near the hearth, and a frigid, damp, stale air zone everywhere else. This was the right way to build. It was the price one paid for security, and it was killing men slowly with lung sickness, rheumatism, and exhaustion. Jedediah Miller was a walking testament to this failed tradition. He was a veteran of the mountains, a man who respected mass and force. His 16 by 20-foot claim cabin, built in 1881, was a monument to conventional wisdom. He had used the best 14-inch pine, meticulously notched. His door was a masterpiece of brute force, laminated from 3 layers of 2-inch planking, weighing easily 150 pounds. It had cost him 45 Like in hardware alone, a significant sum. But the system had a critical flaw. In the spring of 1882, a large bear, drawn by the smell of bacon, hadn't bothered with the door's planks. Instead, it had hooked its claws into the frame, which was merely nailed to the log ends, and pulled the entire 3-by-6-foot assembly outward, hinges and all, in less than a minute. Miller had shot the bear, but the failure haunted him. His fix was to reinstall the frame and add a massive 6-inch thick timber bar on the inside. This new layer of security only exacerbated his primary problem. He was now a prisoner in his own home. To get air, he had to unbar and open the heavy door, exposing himself completely. To stay safe, he had to seal himself inside the smoky tomb. By February 1883, the interior walls of his cabin were coated in a thick, sticky layer of creosote and ice. His smoke lung, a persistent, racking cough, cost him hours of sleep and productivity. His cabin, intended as a sanctuary, had become a siege engine pointed at its own occupant. Silas Weir was not a mountain man. He was an anomaly, a man who had spent the first 40 years of his life in Bath, Maine, working as a master shipwright. He arrived in Colorado in 1882, a lunger seeking the dry air, though his affliction came from shipyard dust, not tuberculosis. Where Jed Miller saw a landscape of trees and rocks, Silas saw a problem of structural engineering and fluid dynamics. In the shipyards, he had learned that a hull's integrity wasn't just in its plank thickness, but in its framing. He knew that a ship's greatest enemy after a reef was stagnant air, the rot, mold, and disease that festered in the unventilated holds. He was a master of using wind sails, cowls, and internal baffling to keep air moving, to keep the ship alive. When he arrived, he was appalled by the trapper's box. He saw it not as a fortress, but as a poorly designed container. Before building, he spent time observing. He watched the local Ute camps, fascinated by their teepees. He noted the ozan, the interior liner that stopped 12 inches from the ground. He saw how this, combined with the adjustable smoke flaps at the apex, created a perfect chimney effect. The lodge pulled fresh air in from the bottom gap, channeled it up between the liner and the cover, and exhausted smoke and hot air perfectly. It was a passive, self-regulating ventilation engine. He also recalled the louvered tobacco barns of the South, which used cross-ventilation to cure crops without letting in the rain. When Silas filed his claim, Jed Miller and the other prospectors watched his build with open amusement. First, Silas chose smaller logs, averaging only 10 inches. Easier to seal, less settling, he remarked quietly. He spent the bulk of his time and money not on the logs, but on his openings. He laboriously milled 406-inch timbers for his door and window frames. Then, instead of just nailing these frames to the logs, he cut deep mortises into the log ends and set the frames into the wall itself. He then drilled 1-inch holes through the frames and deep into the logs, pinning the entire assembly with 12-inch iron spikes he'd salvaged from a burned-out freight wagon. His door was a lamination, a 1-inch layer of pine, a sheet of tin painstakingly hammered flat from old cans, and a 1-inch outer layer of hardwood, all bolted together. It was lighter than Miller's door, but vastly stronger. Then came the folly. He took a 2-inch auger and drilled a series of 10 holes, spaced 1 foot apart, near the cabin floor on the north-facing wall. He did the same just under the roof eaves on the south-facing wall. "You're just drilling holes for the snakes, Weir," Miller scoffed, stopping by one afternoon, "and you'll be dead of rheumatism by Christmas, letting the cold in like that." Silas just nodded and proceeded to fit each of the 20 holes, inside and out, with a double layer of 1 4-inch heavy-gauge wire mesh, the kind used for sifting ore. To his neighbors, the cabin looked weak, compromised, and absurdly porous. The conflict between the two cabins was a conflict of philosophies. Jed Miller represented the brute force school of thought. His was a worldview of mass. If a bear pushes, you must have more wood than he has muscle. If the cold presses in, you must have a hotter fire. His cabin was a static dam built to resist the forces of nature, and it was cracking under the strain. Silas Weir represented the integral system school. His was a worldview of dynamics. He knew the frame, not the door, was the failure point. He knew that a laminate structure, by cross-graining its layers, resists splitting far better than a single thick plank. Most importantly, he knew that air was a fluid. His cabin was not a dam, it was a conduit. He was designing a passive, thermal-powered engine. The sun, even in winter, would strike the south-facing wall and roof, warming the air inside. This warm, stale, humid air would rise, as it always does, and exit through the high vents under the eaves. This very act of high-volume exhaust would create a slight negative pressure, which would, in turn, pull fresh, cool, dense air in through the low, mesh-covered vents on the shady north side. It was a passive, hydraulic cycle. Jed's cabin was a stagnant, toxic pond. Silas's was a constantly flowing, self-cleaning stream. When Silas lit his small, efficient box stove, another point of mockery from the fireplace purists, the system was amplified. The stove's draft supercharged the cycle, pulling its combustion air from the vents across the floor, not from the room's breathable volume. This distributed the stove's heat evenly, warming the fresh air as it entered, before exhausting both stove smoke and stale room air simultaneously. Mr. Arkwright, a fastidious engineer surveying a potential spur line for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, was the first to quantify the difference. He carried a sling psychrometer and a precision mercury thermometer, and he kept a meticulous log. He visited both cabins in late July 1883 during a blistering dry heat wave. His log entry for 2:00 p.m. July 21st at Jed Miller's cabin reads, "Exterior temp 90° warm. Interior door window barred 96° warm. Humidity 78% from breathing, cooking. Air quality oppressive, high particulate, smell of unwashed linen and old smoke. Occupant is irritable." His entry for 2:30 p.m. at Silas Weir's cabin, exterior temp 90°C, interior door window shut 77°C, humidity 50%, air quality clear, fresh, a distinct, steady airflow measured at 5 feet per second at the north side inlets. The air is moving. It feels 15 degrees cooler than the physical temperature suggests. Arkwright returned in November, during the first major cold snap. At 8:00 a.m., the exterior temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. At Miller's cabin, Arkwright recorded 82 degrees near the roaring fireplace, but 44 degrees and 90% humidity near Miller's bunk. 15 feet away, the walls were weeping with frozen condensation. Miller was burning approximately 1/4 cord of wood per week. At Weir's cabin, Arkwright recorded a nearly uniform temperature of 66 degrees from floor to ceiling. The air was dry, the walls were clean. Silas was burning, by Arkwright's calculation, less than 1 to 8 cord per week. The engineer's report simply stated, "Weir's system uses half the fuel to create a 100% more habitable space." Silas's design was a series of integrated layers, each solving a different problem. Layer 1 was the structural envelope. The bear-proofing was not the door, it was the frame. By pinning the 4-6-inch timbers into the log wall, any force applied to the door was not resisted by a few nails. It was transferred across the entire 14-foot multi-ton log wall. A bear would have to push the entire cabin off its foundation, not just break a single opening. The laminated, cross-grained door, backed by tin, would not split. It was, in shipbuilding terms, a collision bulkhead. Layer 2 was the ventilation engine. This was the foolish trick. The 2-inch diameter of the vents was a critical dimension. It was too small for a bear's paw or muzzle to gain purchase. It was too small for a raccoon. The double layer of 1 to 4-inch steel oar mesh, screwed directly into the logs, was impossible for claws to tear or teeth to grip. It was a semi-permeable membrane, calibrated to let air in, but nothing else. Layer 3 was the physics. The stack effect, or thermosiphon, was the true genius. It was an automatic, self-regulating system. The colder and denser the air outside, the stronger the pull of the warm air rising inside, and thus the more efficient the draft. It meant that in the deepest cold of winter, the system worked best, drawing in the most oxygen-rich air, pre-warming it by mixing it with the stove's radiant heat, and distributing it completely. It solved the problem of smoke by ensuring the fireplace always had a positive draft. And it solved the problem of stale air by replacing the entire volume of the cabin's air several times per hour. The ultimate test came on a hot, windless night in late August 1883. The valley was being terrorized by a massive, old grizzly boar, a problem bear that had already destroyed 2 supply caches. The sound that woke Silas was not a crash, but a heavy, deliberate testing. A 700-pound animal pressing its shoulder against his laminated door. Silas lay still, listening. He saw the door flex, but the 4 6-inch frame held. The iron pins, deep in the logs, transferred the load. There was a sound of immense frustration. A whoof, and then the scrape of claws on wood. The claws found no purchase, no edge to grip. The bear moved around the cabin. It smelled the fresh air coming from the low vents on the north wall. Silas heard it snuffing, then digging, the sound of claws tearing at the wire mesh. But the mesh was set flush against the log. The bear's claws couldn't get under it. The 2-inch hole gave no purchase. The animal huffed, roared once in pure rage, and moved on. It went straight to Jed Miller's cabin. It found the 150-pound door, barred with a 6-inch beam. It pushed, the bar held, the door held. The frame, repaired and reinforced, held. The bear, stymied at the obvious entry point, did what bears do. It found another. It climbed the low-pitched, sod-covered roof. With its immense strength, it tore the sod and planking off the roof as if opening a tin of sardines. Miller, screaming, fired his rifle blindly through the new, gaping hole in his ceiling, driving the bear off into the night. Silas Weir's cabin, untouched, safe, and filled with fresh air. Jed Miller's cabin, structurally intact at the door, but now completely open to the sky, his winter supplies, his bed, his life, exposed to the elements just 6 weeks before the first snow. The next morning, Jed Miller appeared at Silas's door. He was pale, smeared with soot, his rifle in his hand. He looked at the claw marks on Silas's door. He walked around to the north wall and stared at the bent but unbroken mesh coverings on the vents. He looked at Silas, who was calmly drinking coffee in a clean, bright room. Miller didn't say a word. He just pointed at the doorframe. "Iron pins," Silas said. Miller nodded. "How many?" Within a week, Miller and 2 other prospectors were at Silas's cabin, not asking for help, but offering to trade labor. Silas supervised as they retrofitted their cabins, not with vents, it was too late in the season for that, but with weir frames. They tore out their old, nailed-in frames and spent the time to set new, heavy timbers deep into the log walls. That winter, when the great blizzard of '84 hit, burying the valley in 12 feet of snow for 3 weeks, Silas's 14 by 16-foot cabin held 4 men. His wife, Mary, who had joined him in the fall, managed the single stove and the cooking. The cabin became a life raft. With 4 adults breathing, a normal cabin would have become an oxygen-starved toxic box, but Silas's vents just worked. The increased respiration and body heat simply accelerated the stack effect. The draft strengthened, pulling in fresh air as fast as the occupants consumed it. "It's the air," Mary noted, her nursing background obvious. "It moves the heat. It doesn't let the sickness settle." Mr. Arkwright returned the following spring to survey the blizzard's impact. His report to the railroad was a technical sensation in Denver. It wasn't a story. It was a statistical comparison. Traditional cabins, Miller et al. 20% loss of integrity, roof chinking failure. Wood consumption 4, 2 cords, AVG. Occupant health, 3 of 5 cases of lung fever or severe rheumatism. His entry for the Weir cabin was stark. Weir cabin, W4 occupants, 0% structural failure. Wood consumption 2 1 cords. Occupant health, 0 cases of sickness. The report concluded, the Weir system is not an improvisation. It is a permanent engineered solution to high-altitude shelter. By 1885, the hardware store in Leadville was selling pre-drilled 4x6 timbers as Weir frames and stocking 1/4-inch heavy-gauge steel mesh, which it marketed as Weir screening. The railroad adopted the design for all its high-country section houses and depots. The foolish trick had become the new standard. Jed Miller, his lungs now clear, became its most vocal advocate, teaching new prospectors how to build. "It's just sense," he'd bellow. "You don't fight the mountain, you let it breathe for you." Years later, the ruins of that silver boom still litter the high valleys. The trappers' boxes are gone, their logs long since collapsed into the earth, their poorly set frames rotted away. But here and there, you can still find the remnants of a Weir-influenced cabin. They are identifiable by the door and window frames, often still standing, the logs having fallen around them, the integrity of the iron pins holding true. Silas Weir's innovation was a profound shift in thinking. He proved that survival in extreme environments is not about brute force, but about intelligent design. It is not about resisting nature, but about channeling it. You don't defeat a bear with more wood, you defeat it with superior geometry. And you don't survive the cold and the dark by sealing yourself in a tomb. You survive it by building a system that understands the fundamental physics of the air you breathe.